Welcome and good evening, everyone, and thank you for your presence. What brings us here tonight is an epidemic of opioids ignited by America's insatiable appetite for prescription pain medication, heroin, and synthetic opioids. An epidemic fueled by well-meaning but often underinformed doctors who write millions upon millions of prescriptions to ease what ails their teenage patients suffering sports injuries, to ease the ails of those older adult patients with chronic pain. We are here tonight to confront an epidemic where heroin is as common in the bucolic, quiet suburbs of anywhere USA as it is in the tough and gritty streets of Baltimore and Dallas, Los Angeles, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and here in our nation's capital. An epidemic that has killed hundreds of thousands of women and men over the years, many of them simply too young, and forever harmed untold thousands of families. We are here tonight to confront an epidemic of opioids that has brought focused attention to the reality that addiction to opioids, alcohol, and other drugs, addiction does not discriminate. We at the Hazel and Betty Ford Foundation have known this to be true since 1949. But what brings us here tonight is not only the opioid epidemic, because tonight we gather here in the Listener Auditorium at George Washington University because we know there is a solution to this epidemic, a solution that has already seen a drop of 18% in the number of opioid prescriptions written by docs in the past 5 years. A solution that includes a medication to reverse overdose, and so already thousands of lives have been saved. A solution that includes the use of medication to treat addiction, medication that helps patients to manage their cravings and gain traction in the never-easy process of getting well. A solution that includes communities coming together, not only to confront the reality that addiction does not discriminate, but to make sure that recovery doesn't discriminate either. This gathering is proof that together we can persevere. Welcome, everyone. My name is William Moyers, and I've worked for Hazel and now the Hazel and Betty Ford Foundation for the past 22 years. Before that, I went to treatment at Hazelden because I had developed a baffling inability to just say no to alcohol and other drugs, which also makes me an alum and makes me a person in recovery from addiction. Recovery, what a gift professionally. Recovery, what a gift personally. I am fortunate. I am a grateful and fortunate man. I am a spouse, a father, a citizen, a voter, because I am a man in recovery. Tonight, though, I am the host of this town hall meeting, which means I'm in charge of the logistics, and I am in charge of keeping us moving and on time. Applause, please. You're good. Our agenda is ambitious, with a lot of moving parts. We have 2 panels of experts, we have plenty of Q&A, and we have special appearances by several members of Congress. You know, that legislative body down the hall here. This event is also being streamed live on Facebook, and so whether you're here in this room or watching it online, we encourage you to engage throughout the event on social media using the hashtag Opioid Town Hall. But please, if you are going to engage in social media this evening, and we encourage you to do so, we also demand that you do it with your phone on silent. We also want you to gather your questions throughout the evening so that our participants up here, and there are no better experts than who you will encounter here tonight, so that our participants up here on the stage can address them later on during the program. And so please, post your questions online using the hashtag Opioid Town Hall. Also, if you're in the room, you can write them down. If you're old like I am, you can write them down on one of those index cards that you'll find somewhere out there. Feel free to capture your questions on those cards and pass them down to the end of the aisle, and we will have volunteers who collect them. And speaking of volunteers, this evening I want to thank everyone here at George Washington University and all of our attendees who are in D.C. for the 8th Annual Conference of the Association of Recovery and Higher Education and the 6th Annual Conference of the Association of Recovery Schools, as well as the leaders of those great organizations. Collegiate and high school recovery programs, yay! Collegiate and high school recovery programs are an enormous part of addressing addiction, and so it's inspiring to see all of these young faces here on this campus this week and here this evening. I have to tell you, by the way, diverting from the script for just a moment, that while as a professional I've always appreciated the role that sober communities have played on college campuses, but it was only in the past year that I personally began or came to understand and appreciate and value the role of a recovery community, a sober recovery community on a campus, because my own daughter, Nancy, who's 20 years old, about a year ago, she came to me and said, "Dad, I need help." And a year later, she is a proud member of the Step Up program at Augsburg College in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And I want to recognize Patrice Salmeri, if she's out there anywhere. Where is Patrice? Patrice. Thank you for your leadership over all these years, but thank you for your influence in the Moyers family lives. Thank you, Patrice. I'm also grateful to have some leaders here from our own organization, the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation, including our president and CEO, Mark Mishik. Mark, thank you. As well as several members of our board of trustees, including Mary Farnham Whitney. Mary, thank you so much. Washington, D.C.'s very own Bill Lammers. Bill, thank you. And the Twin Cities' very own Mike Syme. Thank you, Mike, for being here. And Tori, you're not on the board, but thank you for your role and your volunteer leadership at the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. Finally, I want to thank my colleagues, my friends, and my fellow travelers who lead the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation's Institute for Recovery Advocacy. Jeremiah Gardner and Dean Peterson, who have spent innumerable hours preparing for this event and whose passion for the cause is matched by their knowledge and their energy. Thank you, Jeremiah, and thank you, Dean, for your remarkable work that's resulted in this evening. And finally, to my dear friend and fellow traveler and colleague of 20-plus years, Nick Motu, the Vice President of our Institute for Recovery Advocacy, who leads this organization's efforts to educate every generation about addiction, treatment, and recovery issues. It takes a team, and Nick Motu leads that team. Thank you, Nick. Now, before we go any further, it's my pleasure. Here it comes, Amy. It's my pleasure to introduce Amy Boyd Austin. Amy is the founding director of the University of Vermont's Catamount Recovery Program and the current board president for the Association of Recovery and Higher Education, who co-sponsored tonight's event with our Hazelden Betty Ford Institute for Recovery Advocacy. Amy has worked tirelessly in this field of substance use and recovery for the past 24 years as a licensed social worker, addiction counselor, educator, administrator, and advocate, which means she is an expert. Amy, please. Thank you very much.
Wow, this is awesome. So I'm just going to repeat some of his words and say, welcome. Welcome to the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation Opioid Town Hall here at the 8th Annual Collegiate Recovery Conference. As Bill said, I'm Amy Boyd Austin, the president of the Association of Recovery and Higher Education. The association empowers collegiate recovery programs and their professionals to support students in recovery from substance use and other addictive behaviors. We do this through our strategic approaches that also speak to our values. We strive to support schools to develop CRPs with an eye toward sustainability and a goal of indispensability. We work to help collegiate recovery champions and stakeholders to connect with resources both inside and outside their schools and to collaborate in creative and often non-traditional ways. And we work to educate on how to do all these things on a grand scale, like the conference, research, toolkits, town halls. To the more individual and personal scale, one-on-ones, phone calls, technical assistance, and visits where we just get to talk and connect with one another. And lastly, we embrace and hopefully inspire advocacy as an effort to break down stigma and bias that behavioral health issues like substance use disorders and recovery carry, so our schools and our young people can find recovery earlier. Everywhere you turn, the opiate crisis in the US is a headline. Efforts to get it under control include decreasing overprescription of opioid painkillers by physicians, education about the long-term effects of opioid use, and more stringent guidelines for prescribing. There are efforts and issues regarding control of illicit drugs entering the country. And there's the need to increase accessibility to treatment for people struggling to find recovery. All of these are important pieces of the puzzle, but we also need to build a future for folks who find a path to recovery and are looking to continue to grow. We see collegiate recovery as an ideal solution. When young people have the opportunity to find recovery, and that recovery provides access to higher education and professional development, then you change the trajectory of that student's life. You've helped build a better future, not just for that person, but for all of us. I want to spend 1 minute on what you can do to help. You're here, so that's awesome. Great first step. You are accessing information and hopefully bringing it back to your school, your treatment center, your office, your agency, and your community in an effort to help shift the culture, break down that stigma around substance use disorders, and to build and better the paths to accessing and maintaining recovery. We hope you either are already a member of ARHE or you will consider becoming one during the conference. We hope you can stay through the discussion tonight. We do have a slightly later start time tomorrow if that helps to keep you in there, and that you'll submit a question to the panelists, Twitter or through the index cards. I vote for old school myself. Find out what's happening to support collegiate recovery in your state or at the college or university nearest you. Use your voice, get involved, become an advocate for collegiate recovery at home or through ARHE, and help make a difference for students in recovery. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. It is my great honor to introduce Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island. Senator Whitehouse, he's from a small state, but his leadership looms large for all Americans on the issues related to addiction, treatment, and recovery. Senator Whitehouse authored the historic and bipartisan, remember those days, bipartisan? He authored the historic and bipartisan Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act. We all know it as CARA. 1 year ago this week in Congress, that legislation was passed, setting an important new precedent for thinking about addiction as a public health issue, not just a law enforcement issue. Please help me welcome Senator Sheldon Whitehouse.
Thank you, William. And thank you all for being here, particularly anybody who's from Brown or URI or Rick, there we go. I'm really delighted to be here, and I want to thank a great Rhode Islander, Tom Kader of Altarum, for inviting me here. And recognize Jonathan Goyer, who works at one of our great recovery facilities in Rhode Island, Anchor Recovery, which I've worked with for many, many years. Rhode Island is a state very much at the epicenter of the opioid crisis that America faces. In the last year, we had 1,500 emergency room visits. We had nearly 300 fatalities. The EMTs in Rhode Island are the only two drugs that they administer, the only two things that they administer more than naloxone are saline and oxygen. And if you're an EMT, you administer saline and oxygen to pretty much everybody. So we are really in the grip of this crisis. And we are working hard to try to fight our way through it. And one of the ways we're doing this is with the response to an overdose. An overdose is obviously a medical emergency, but it is also a treatment and realization opportunity. And we need to strengthen that opportunity, and it's one of the reasons I'm so glad to be talking with all of you. Things like Good Samaritan laws that make people feel comfortable that they can call 911 without calling the cops in on themselves and save a life. Training for families so that they understand how to use naloxone, particularly as very powerful new versions of fentanyl sometimes require multiple applications of the Narcan. We are moving to having on-scene advocates in our emergency rooms. It's a new requirement that at certain levels our trauma centers have to have peer recovery support on scene. I spent a long evening not too long ago at our main emergency room, and they talked me through what they did when somebody came in and they were overdosing. And what they urged was that you really needed to talk to that person right then with peer support right then, because when you let them off after they were treated, very often by the time that they might call somebody, if you just put a card in their pocket, it was the next day and they were already high again. You had to seize that moment. We also need to make sure that people are confident that their insurance is adequate to pay for this. Somebody who is in this situation and is having to work through the various bureaucratic approvals or pre-approvals could be in a situation in which that becomes the thing that prevents them from getting the treatment, returns them to the street, returns them to getting high, and leads to yet another overdose. And then finally, we need to try to make sure we find a way around some of the HIPAA restrictions. These privacy rules are there for a very, very good reason. But we had a real tragedy in Rhode Island where an adult child repeatedly came to the emergency room overdosed, and his parents were left in the dark. They were unable to inform them what was going on. And the fourth overdose was the fatal one. And that's when they found out. We need to make sure that folks who are in recovery or who are using drugs are able to designate people who can be called, and you can work through the HIPAA problem, because an important part of recovery is having the people who love you and care for you around you able to support what you need to do. The CARA bill will help support a lot of this. We worked very hard on it. It was 3 years of constant old-fashioned legislative legwork, 5 separate national seminars here in Washington, enormous amounts of advice from the recovery community, law enforcement community, medical community, groups like veterans groups and women's groups to make sure that nobody was being left back. And the result of all that work was a bill that had unstoppable momentum in the House and in the Senate. There were efforts to slow it down for a variety of reasons, but the bipartisan strength behind it was so great that whatever obstacle anybody put in front of it, we just blew through it. And we ended up on the floor, and I think it got 87 votes. It was a blowout success. And I want you to take I want you to take two messages from that. One is that although we indeed are a divided Congress and there are very significant philosophical and political disagreements in Congress, when it comes to solving the opioid problem, there is very strong bipartisan support. And we are going to keep dialing it up until we are ahead of this crisis. We are not there yet, but the signs of progress we've made so far are good ones. And it is bipartisan and it is sincere. And that, I think, is a good sign in a divided Washington. The second lesson is that the days of stigma are receding. This was a conversation about how you treat people who have an illness, how you take care of people who have an illness, how you make sure that people who have a dangerous illness are able to stay safe. There was no longer the conversation about how people who have addiction are bad people, how shunning or silence or shame or punishment are the right remedies. Those were the dark, bad old days. I believe we are through those days, but one thing that we can commit to do together is to use our own voices in every way that we can to push out the message that this is an illness, and that when people recognize it and begin to walk that very difficult and noble path of recovery, they're not entitled just to our support, they're entitled to our respect. This is not easy, and they are doing brave and wonderful things. The last thing that I'll ask you for is your help. One of the things that the CARA bill did was to urge that the prescription drug monitoring programs that the various states run coordinate better. As you go to your home states, it would be good to send that message out. This is a big, big resource for all of us, to have the information about who is being prescribed what, so that you can step in and doctors who are acting as pill mills or people who are not being sensitive to the limitations on how much is appropriate, or people who shouldn't be prescribing this stuff in the first place, we have a chance to intervene and choke off some of the illicit supply. So getting a national standard in place for interconnected prescription drug monitoring programs that report properly and timely is a goal that CARA supports and that we can encourage everybody to work towards under the ambit of CARA. Finally, let me just thank the Hazelden Betty Ford Clinic for hosting all of this, and to ARHE for reaching to our student populations and making sure that people in college understand that this is an illness that you can have just like any other. You don't have to be a certain age or type or anything to get this, and that your universities are behind you in helping you to deal with any addiction, to get recovery, and to succeed both in college and in life. And I appreciate very much the work that both Betty Ford and ARHE are doing. So thank you for being here together. We're on a great mission together. We've got a lot of successes that we've achieved in the past few years, but we also have big tasks ahead of us that I hope we can go forward towards with optimism and confidence and a sense of joy in what recovery can bring to people's lives. Thank you very much.
And now to our topic for this evening. Senator Whitehouse talked a little bit about it. It's a life-saving medication, a controversial medication, naloxone, the opioid overdose revival medication, also known by the brand name of Narcan, has been a huge focus of addiction-related public policy in recent years. And it's been a success, saving many lives around the country, probably many lives in your own hometown. Sadly, though, even after surviving near-death overdoses, many, if not most, of the people who receive naloxone, they return to using some overdose again, and sadly, too many die. Every day in every corner of this nation, medical and law enforcement, first responder professionals and families are coming face to face with people who need professional care for opioid use disorder, knowing full well that when addiction remains, those lives remain in immediate danger. Most healthcare providers, law enforcement officers, and loved ones, they want to help to do more. But what exactly is a police officer to do after administering naloxone, or an EMT, emergency room doctor, or even a parent? These are just the types of questions that we're here this evening to discuss as part of our solution. And the big overarching one is this: how can we best put overdose survivors on the road to recovery rather than back on the path of addiction? Jarred by immediate withdrawal symptoms, few people revived from an opioid overdose are eager to get help. Instead, most are motivated right away by the intense desire to make their agonizing withdrawal symptoms go away, a problem solved most easily, sadly, by using again. Such behavior seems irrational to many people, yet as many of us here know all too well, it reflects the very nature of substance use disorder. Fear of both pain and fear of the unknown, and an inability to recognize one's need for help are among the many reasons that only, sadly, 10% of people with a substance use disorder actually get professional care. Clearly, whether they realize it or not, most people who overdose have an illness that is imminently life-threatening. Still, people revived are most often sent home or simply provided a list of treatment options at a time when their state of mind is not conducive to thinking about a life transformation. Naloxone administration, especially in medical and law enforcement settings, presents a unique opportunity to connect people to the care that they need and to the care that they deserve. But how do we intervene effectively to help them say yes to treatment and recovery? This is a logical next step in fighting the opioid crisis, but it's a complex issue that requires a robust public dialogue, and hence our program here this evening. Our discussion is even more important in the face of something that we've begun to hear a lot about. Well, it started back in April. It's called compassion fatigue. That is, fatigue among people working to save overdose victims, and in some cases, outright hostility. Just recently, many of you have probably read that a city council member in the state of Ohio suggested ambulances should not be dispatched to rescue people who overdose more than twice. And a sheriff in the same state decided he will no longer equip his deputies with naloxone. Both cited cost concerns as well as safety. Clearly, we all have still got a lot of work to do in terms of smashing the stigma that Senator Whitehouse talked about and in helping people understand the very nature of this illness. And at the same time, we understand that frustration is not unusual. Loved ones of people with addiction get tired and exasperated too. But let's be clear. Giving up on people with addiction by refusing to save their life is not only the wrong solution, it is the fatal solution. And tonight we're going to look for some better alternatives. We have two very impressive panels to tackle the question of how to get the best care to overdose survivors with an expert moderator from my one-time employer, CNN. But first we have the special guest who's already gone, Senator Whitehouse. So we'll get right to it. At this time, it is my great honor to invite Elizabeth Cohen, CNN's senior medical correspondent, to come out and join us to moderate these panels. I must say that it is appropriate and it is very heartening to have her join us this evening. She's a journalist whose expertise is medical news, medical issues. And here tonight, she's here to be part of this topic on the medical topic of addiction. It was the American Medical Association that formally declared alcoholism a disease in 1954 and 1955, but as we know, and as Senator Whitehouse talked about, too many people still think it's moral failing or just simply bad choices. And so to have a journalist of Elizabeth's caliber, one whose expertise is the medical community, well, we couldn't have had a better journalist than Elizabeth Cohen. She is a senior medical correspondent for CNN's Health, Medical, and Wellness Unit, reporting on breaking news, medical news, and health consumer reporting for CNN and CNN.com. Her book, The Empowered Patient, was published in August of 2010. And in her illustrious career, she has earned numerous awards for her reporting on diverse topics such as end-of-life medical decisions, bone marrow transplants among African Americans, obsessive-compulsive disorders among teens, and families affected by mental illness. In other words, Elizabeth knows her stuff. And tonight, she knows ours, too. On a personal note, Elizabeth joined CNN in 1991, a year before I did. And while she doesn't remember me, I clearly remember her way back then, and I have always admired your work, Elizabeth, and I am honored that you were part of tonight's event. Please help me welcome our moderator, Elizabeth Cohen. There she is. Thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah. You got a note? You're good? Okay. Oh, you're right. Yeah. Well, I'm the one who's going to introduce the panel. Yeah, okay, great. She's still telling me what to do. While Elizabeth gets situated, I'd like our first panelist to come out. I'm going to keep my introductions very brief just to keep us on time, and because their bios are in your programs, you can find the details on their backgrounds. And those who are online, you can find those at the event webpage. Remember, the hashtag is Opioid Town Hall. And with that, let's bring them out one at a time, starting with Nathan Karanda, a paramedic for the Hennepin County Medical Center in Minneapolis. Tammy Smith, a forensic counselor with the Sheriff's Office in Lucas County, Ohio, and a key member of what they call their Drug Abuse Response Team, or DART. Dr. Catherine Hawk, an emergency medicine physician and researcher at Yale. And finally, Dr. Jonathan Goyer, a young man in recovery who is a manager with Anchor Recovery Community Centers in Pawtucket and Warwick, Rhode Island, and an expert advisor to the Governor's Task Force on Overdose Prevention and Intervention. Welcome, everybody, and Elizabeth, take it away.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to this wonderful event tonight. I feel honored to be surrounded by all of you, and especially by these panelists. I had some time to talk to them before, and they're all doing such amazing work to combat this epidemic. There's so much to talk about on the subject of addiction, and so I want to sort of put a framework out here now, which is that we're really focused on a sliver, and that is the moment of revival. In a movie, in Hollywood, someone would get revived with naloxone. They would sit up. They would say, "Thank you." They would say, "Where's the nearest recovery center? Can you direct me there?" Mm-hmm. And there would be a place available, and there would be funds available, and it would all go well. I was talking about this with Jeremiah Gardner at Hazelden, and he said, "Elizabeth, that would be a movie that clearly didn't hire a consultant." So Hollywood should hire you for consultants on the moment of recovery, of revival rather. What does that moment look like? What are the challenges of that moment? And what are the opportunities that that moment presents? And all of you are experts on that in one way or another. And so Nathan, let's start with you. Can you speak broadly about your experience as a paramedic and helping people who are victims of overdose?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Before I start out, I'd like to first say thank you. It's an incredible opportunity to be here today. And the second thing is that I can be very opinionated on this topic, and I just want to clarify that any opinions I do express today, they're 100% my own, and they don't belong to Hennepin County Medical Center. That being said, I am a paramedic. But the first cardiac arrest I worked wasn't in the back of an ambulance, it was in my home. I was 19 years old, I woke up, And as a family, we found my brother Chris dead from a heroin overdose in the basement. We rushed to his side, performed CPR, and despite our very best efforts, we weren't able to revive him. And I can't sum up who Chris was in a couple sentences, so I'll just tell you that he meant a lot to us as a family, and we loved him dearly. And when I got into paramedic school, first off, I'd never even heard about naloxone or Narcan. But I knew at that particular point that I wanted to have at least one or two experiences throughout my entire career where I'd have an opportunity to give it. And that opportunity came pretty early on when we got a call for a diabetic emergency. When we responded, I knelt down next to this patient, looked at his pale, lifeless body. He was barely breathing, and I realized pretty rapidly that this wasn't a diabetic emergency, but it was an opioid overdose. As a team, the fire department, police department, and paramedics rendered care, delivered rescue breathing, started an IV, and I gave Narcan for the first time. And I got to tell you, that experience still sticks out to me to this day. Because I took somebody who was literally inches away from death and brought him back to life. And it's how it felt is how you would expect saving a life would feel. And I hoped that it would happen again, or that I would have the opportunity to save a life again, and it did happen again. But then it happened again, and it happened again. And I've reversed close to 40 at this particular point. As a service, Hennepin County Medical Center in 2013 gave naloxone 450 times. By 2016, it was up to 915, and we'll probably close in on 1,000 by the end of this year. I've knelt next to people in fast food restaurants, lifted them off of bathroom floors, dragged them out of the middle of roads. And while all of these calls are different in context, at the core, they're all the same. There's always somebody out there who's struggling, and there's somebody in their lives who loves them.
I would imagine that each time you've used naloxone, it may be a little bit different. But can you describe, for those of us who have not been present at a moment like that, what does that moment of revival look like?
It's a gasp of life. I mean, you have somebody who's it's lifeless. The body, when you get on scene, if there's somebody there in the background, they're screaming. These people are literally losing their breath. They're going from respiratory depression into respiratory arrest, and then eventually cardiac arrest. And when you give this drug, I mean, there's so few things that have like a fix like this, like an antidote. And to give this medication in the field has felt miraculous at times and frustrating, because I know that at this particular point, the system isn't set up to get these people from that point into the next point, which is recovery.
That's my next question. You described the incredible feeling that you feel when you save someone's life. But what do you do next? What do you do after you've revived that person?
Sure. So, I mean, my Chris died, and I've been on far too many of these calls. And so, there's a part of my heart that, wants to scream out when, I've gotten this person back. I want to grab them by the shoulders. I want to shake them. I want to point at their family. I want to, use every word that I have at my disposal to try to get them to understand that they've just been gifted with this second chance, and now they have to get into recovery right away. And, the reality is the realization that I've come to is that I don't possess the words to make that a reality in that particular moment. Because the power of addiction is greater than the fear of death. And so what I've taken to do is just treat these individuals with the respect, integrity, dignity, love, and compassion that I treat everybody else with who's in the back of my ambulance.
Do you give them referrals to recovery centers? Do you have discussions with them?
It's, I'd like to. I don't know. It's just not, we're managing too much, I think, at that particular point, and I believe it would be doing everybody a disservice to start that conversation there. I believe there is some value in letting them know what happened because they weren't witnesses to that overdose. So in a calm, cool, collected manner, telling them what just took place, I believe has value. But as far as initiating a discussion for where they can go to recovery, really what I'm most fixated on is just getting them to the hospital at that particular point. And sometimes that's even challenging to get them to understand because, and that speaks volumes to how powerful naloxone is. Because you have somebody who you have seen was just about dead, and you bring them back to a point where they don't even really understand that they've just had this near-death experience.
Gotcha. Tammy, let's move on to you for a moment. You're a social worker, but you work with law enforcement, Lucas County Sheriff's Office in Toledo, Ohio. And you have a really innovative program in your county. When you go to address someone who's in an overdose situation, you don't arrest them, even though your folks are law enforcement.
Yes, ma'am.
Talk about what you do.
Like Nathan, thank you also for having me here this evening. I work with Lucas County Sheriff's Office. I am a forensic counselor for them. Sheriff Tharp, who is the current sheriff there, initiated a program called DART. It is called the Drug Enforcement Task Force. And that was about 3 years ago. One of the things that he observed when he took office was that in the county jail itself, we were experiencing an increase in, at that time, he didn't really know what it was, but it came to be opiate overdoses, opiate withdrawal signs and symptoms. Sheriff Tharp is an amazing sheriff. At that time, I was actually a counselor in the jail, working on the second floor, which is the medical division. And Sheriff Tharp actually would come in and walk the floors throughout the jail. On this one particular day, I can recall him in a three-piece suit. He was very nicely dressed. And we had an individual in there who was experiencing, withdrawal symptoms from opiate. They were vomiting, they had the chills, they had diarrhea going. And Sheriff Tharp actually rolled up his pant legs and got a mop bucket and, helped the gentleman mop up the fluids. From there, he then went to command and pretty much was like, what is going on? We pretty much discussed that, there was this issue going on in this community. We were getting this influx of individuals coming in that were withdrawing. So he went to local EMS, to the fire chiefs, sat down with them, and they decided they needed to come up with this plan where they initiated DART. DART currently is a 20-man unit. I should say 20-man and women unit. We utilize both law enforcement, social services, local mental health agencies. We have individuals in the unit from public library, all the way down to park rangers. And you ask, why the library, why park rangers? Because those are the areas that the overdoses are taking place. We link individuals into services. It's not about arresting the individual, once they're revived from naloxone or with naloxone. It's about linking them into services, getting them linked so that they can become, again, on the right path of recovery. We concentrate on, prevention services, intervention. We do a lot with education. Today, again, it's been 3 years. We've seen probably about 2,000, maybe 2,075 new cases. That doesn't include the repeats, because unfortunately individuals do repeat. It doesn't include all of the loved ones that are associated with that person that's overdosed. So if we included them, I would probably triple the number. But getting individuals linked into services, we're probably at about a 74% success rate. Getting them linked into detox.
So I want to ask you more about the success rate, but before, can you just walk me through the mechanics? Your team, your officers get a call that there's been an overdose. How do they respond, and how does that response differ from the way most law enforcement agencies would respond?
And it is a little bit different. Again, it's not about the arrest, it's about linking that individual into treatment. One of the things we did is partner. We partnered with local EMS. We partnered with mental health services. So once EMS actually brings that individual into the hospital, our DART officers actually go to the hospital. There's that small period of time, that small window of opportunity to link that individual into services. Nathan, you had spoke on the fact that individuals don't know possibly that they've overdosed or don't realize that they've overdosed. So the officers go in and they explain all of that. We utilize motivational interview skills. We engage them. They're not suspects. They're considered to be clients. We link them into services.
Your officers in uniform when they go out to the hospital?
They are not. That is another good thing that we do. It's about making that human connection with that individual. And one of the things that we've noticed is, those old stereotypical hard spotlight, hard chair kind of things, those tactics don't work. So we go in plain clothes. We have business suits and business attire. We utilize donated cars. Again, good partnerships with the community. And we link, again, these individuals into detox. We try to do like a 2-year program with them. Because again, it's not just, a quick, fast kind of thing. So we're with them for 2 years. We do formal and informal, assessments with them. We utilize non-traditional methods. And by that, I mean, a lot of individuals have text or cell phones today. So we do text messaging. We use emails. We do home visits. We go to the hospitals. We go to the parks. We go to coffee shops to meet with individuals. We try to be with them on their terms, on their grounds. We don't want to bring them into the office.
So you're doing house calls, for want of a better phrase. Okay.
Pretty much.
So for every overdose, for every person who's overdosed, you visit them in the hospital. You follow up with them for 2 years?
We follow them for 2 years, and then in addition to that particular person, we also work with the families as well. Because addiction isn't just about that person, but it's also about the family.
And let's talk about that success rate for a minute. Say the number again and tell me what that number is. It's the percent of people who you visit in the hospital who end up going into a recovery program? Is
Correct.
That it?
It's 74%, and that's over a 3-year period of time. And what that is the linkage of individuals that we've linked into a detox location, which is trying in itself, because in our particular county, at one point in time, we only had 16 detox beds.
Wow. How many do you have now?
We're up to 16 plus 20, and it varies at given times. So.
Do you still, is there a wait, or you usually can get people in?
There is, yes, there is a wait. But one of the things with the unit is, because of the partnerships that we've actually made with the mental health agencies, that wait time has decreased. We're able to do, ongoing support with that individual as they're waiting to try to get linked into services.
And are you working only with people who have suffered an overdose, or are you working with others who are experiencing addiction but have not overdosed?
Now, we're not just working with individuals that have experienced overdose. One of the kind of neat things with this particular unit, when I started in the unit, majority of the individuals that would come into the unit were coming in from EMS referrals or from hospital referrals. But since then, we've actually had a lot of walk-ins. And we've got individuals that will call us from dope houses. and say, hey, I've just shot up. I know that this is not where I want to be. I want to go into recovery. Can you come and help me?
So they're calling you.
They're calling us, and we're going to them.
And that's because word has gotten out about the kind of work that you do, that you're not going to arrest them, that you're going to help them.
That's correct. And clients with the DART unit, they're not allowed to be like CIs or confidential informants. They don't work with other departments to try to give up information. It's about recovery. That is the direction that we're wanting them to go in.
So your officers clearly have training in how to do the post-overdose discussion. Nathan, did you as a paramedic receive training, or since you've been in your profession, have you received training in how to have that discussion post-overdose?
No, not at all. I mean, when I look back over my education as far as what kind of tangible classes or education that we got on, how to verbally de-escalate somebody in a crisis situation, or what you say to somebody after they've just been brought back from an overdose, that was completely missing from anything that we got. And it's incredible to me because so much of emergency medicine is tied together with behavioral health. Mm-hmm. And we're in a unique situation as paramedics because we are essentially injected right into the middle of an ongoing emotional trauma. So we have an incredible power or potential there to direct not only the patient, but the other family members and individuals on scenes, either in a positive direction or in a negative direction. And so what ends up happening, because we don't have that foundation or that education, is you either gain it through experience on the job, or you bring in personal experience, and because we're a capable, resilient people, we're successful at doing that. But just because you're able to keep your head above water doesn't necessarily mean you know how to swim. And so I think that the profession as a whole would benefit from having specific education, or maybe a manual or a mandatory annual certification that they need to uphold, so that we're having the appropriate discussions at the appropriate time with these individuals.
Understood. Jonathan, let's chat with you for a minute. Before we talk about the incredible work that you're doing in Rhode Island, can you talk about your personal connection to addiction?
Yeah, absolutely. Before I do that, I just want to make everybody aware that it's very bright up here. Therefore, it's slightly awkward for me. But I'm here, and I'm grateful to be here. And I don't mean just here in this auditorium. I mean here on planet Earth, here and alive. And that is due to the efforts of folks like this and naloxone in particular. So long story short, I lost my father in 2004 to an overdose, and in 2009 I lost my brother as well. And in 2013 I experienced an overdose, and naloxone saved my life. I wasn't aware of what naloxone was when I woke up in the hospital and they said you got hit with naloxone. I thought somebody hit me with something. I was completely unaware and uneducated on what that was, and when I found out what it was, I began to do research on it. I was really sort of troubled as to think, where was this in 2009 and where was this in 2004, and why wasn't this available to both my father and my brother at the time? So I sort of have incidentally become a recovery advocate, and here I am.
And we are glad. So not only are you, thank God, here with us, but you've started 2 incredible programs in Rhode Island. Can you talk about those 2 programs, the anchor programs?
Absolutely. So there's 2 programs I'm going to talk about, and I feel it necessary to say that what we have in Rhode Island is an Anchor Recovery Community Center, and it is this community center, drop-in center for people in recovery. And it's just this magical place. We get upwards of 400 to 600 people that walk in every day. We host a variety of meetings, 12-step meetings, other peer support meetings, and the 2 programs that are housed out of there are the Anchor ED and the Anchor More program. Anchor ED program stands for Anchor in Emergency Departments, and what that program does is, if a hospital has somebody brought in on an overdose, they will call Anchor, who will dispatch a peer recovery coach, somebody with lived experience, to respond to the hospital within 30 minutes. Every hospital in the state of Rhode Island, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they can meet with a peer recovery coach. Now my program is... Which is part of my story, by the way, that I left out. I gave you the 17-second version. But when I woke up in the hospital, my first thought was that I needed a cigarette. My second thought was that I had messed up my life again. And I was prepared to continue to use drugs. But what had happened is 2 friends of mine came in, friends that were in recovery, and they talked to me. And they really empowered me and encouraged me and inspired me to take the next step.
What did they say to you?
Get your act together, and then they slapped me. They let me know that all hope wasn't lost, and that life was still worth living, and that this wasn't a big deal, you know. And that I was really in this fork in the road, and I could live or I could die, and that's what Narcan did for me, right? It afforded me an opportunity to say, oh my God, this is it. If I get high again, I'm not going to end up in jail. I'm not going to end up in a treatment center. I'm going to end up dead. And I have to do something to change my life, and they were there to help me to do that.
Did you not realize that without them telling you? Did you not realize the fork that you were at?
I guess I never thought of it that way. My ultimate goal wasn't really to live. I just turned 30. I don't want to talk about that though. But I never planned to live this long, right? And people in active addiction, we don't operate in a way that we're planning to live long, successful lives. It's really just sort of waiting for impending doom. So the Anchor ED program, the concept had saved me in my own life as well too. The second program that I want to talk about more, because it's my program, is the Anchor More program. And more is a play on words, because I think we all need to do more. And I think every recovery community center can do more, but it's also an acronym for Mobile Outreach Recovery Efforts. And what we do is we take peer recovery coaches and we deploy them into the community. Because why are we waiting for people to walk into a community center to get them help? Why are we waiting for them to overdose to get them help? Right? Or why are we waiting for them to go to prison to help them, right? So let's be a little bit proactive here, and let's do more, and let's get out in the community and connect with individuals that are in great need of services. And what we do is we partnered with the Rhode Island Department of Health, who works with Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, to analyze data from the state. So we have this hub of data. There's a website called www.preventoverdoseri.org. And when you pull that up, it's a map of Rhode Island, and it isolates the 39 municipalities. And every single municipality, it'll tell you how many Narcan administrations there were, how many treatment admissions there were from that town, how many fatal overdose deaths, how many non-fatal overdose deaths, and we can study that data and sort of take this epidemiological approach and deploy resources and peers into those communities that we know are lacking support.
Why is it helpful to have a peer there, someone who's been through this, when you're waking up after an naloxone dose?
So everybody plays a vital role in this when battling this epidemic. The difference of being in a hospital room, for example, and having a doctor walk in with his white coat and clipboard. I don't know if they still wear white coats, but that's what I picture. Saying that you need treatment or you need to get help. It's just not as, people aren't as receptive to that. But when you can send somebody into a room who can sit down next to them and say, I know exactly how you feel, because 4 years ago, I overdosed. And I was able to find recovery, and my life is greatly improved since then. And here's how I did it.
Having been through it, does that allow you to be more sympathetic with them or tougher on them, or both?
I think people with lived experience, good question. That's not in the notes. I think people with lived experience sort of, they get it. Right, they get it, and I think we have this sort of built-in mechanism that can sway both ways as appropriate as it comes, and the level of empathy is there, and that's what we need. Sympathy is one thing, but we need empathy. Empathy is the language of recovery, and it's something that's without a doubt instilled into every person that's in recovery.
Obviously, every person that you help is going to be different. But in all the years you've been doing this, have you found that there are certain things that you say as a part of your empathizing that work better than others?
Again, not in the notes. When we share our own experience, strength, and hope with individuals, I just find that their minds can open up and they can be a little bit more receptive. And with that said, the job of a peer recovery coach is not to get everybody clean and sober at that moment. That is not our job. Nobody can be charged with that. But what we can do is we can plant seeds of hope, and we can be ready for them when they're ready to get into treatment. And that's something else that the Anchor More program does. As we respond to communities in need, we give out our phone numbers, and I tell my people that that's their job all the time. It's not to get everybody into treatment, it's to get your phone number in the pockets of every individual that's suffering from addiction, right? Because when that individual is ready, they're gonna call, and when we call, we can respond immediately.
And do they call you?
They do call, they do call. So this program started very, very small with 2 employees. About 19 months ago, we're up to 7 coaches that are on the street, so statewide throughout Rhode Island. And we've gotten over 400 people into treatment.
Good job.
And when people aren't ready to go into treatment, that's okay. We can still have conversations with them and plant the seeds. And we can also use harm reduction strategies, and we can train them on how to use Narcan and how to keep them alive long enough until they want to live, right? Because that's really what we've got to do. And as a result, we've distributed over 3,000 kits of Narcan to the people that we didn't get into treatment, which accounts for about 40% of Rhode Island's total distribution of Narcan.
Sweet.
That's very good. That's really wonderful. Kate, we're going to turn to you now. In medicine and in public health, we love to set protocols for things. If this happens, you do this. If this happens, you do this. We have protocols for post-heart attack care. We have protocols for when a patient comes in with these certain symptoms. Is there a protocol that's widely used in this country for what to do after someone has been revived with naloxone?
So the short answer is absolutely not. It's, in part, it's a complicated question as far as kind of what we aspire to when developing protocols, because a lot of it really depends on what treatments, resources you have available in your community. For example, I practice at Yale New Haven Hospital in New Haven, and we actually we're very fortunate to have a very rich treatment recovery resources available. And so we have relationships with our emergency departments where we're able to do ED linkages to treatment for substance use disorders. And this is something that we've actually been doing for more than 17 years. Gail D'Onofrio is our department chair and my mentor, and they started the Project Assert program in 1999. And really the goal is to provide education, motivational interview, based intervention, and a referral to treatment. And that's kind of for alcohol and other substances. Clearly in the past couple of years, as the opioid epidemic has just blossomed, and we've experienced a pretty significant heroin problem in our community, we've started to do more specifically around opioid use disorder. And so one of the things that we're doing now is based on a study that, again, Gail D'Onofrio and Dave Filene published in 2015, where we found that if we did ED-initiated buprenorphine for patients that presented to the emergency department with moderate to severe opioid use disorder, they were more than twice as likely to be engaged in treatment 30 days after the visit. For this study, it was 78% of people who were in the group that got ED-initiated buprenorphine were engaged in treatment, as opposed to 37 and 45% who came, who either got a facilitated referral or just a regular referral. And part of why we're able to do that is because of the resources we have available to us.
Is that why everyone doesn't do it, because they don't have those same services available?
So that's part of it. To be honest, I think in emergency medicine, I think we suffer from a lack of understanding that treatment works. And that's part of why it's so amazing to be in a room full of people who just completely understand that treatment works and that addiction is a treatable disease. And it's not rocket science. And although you know, a lot of what I do is talk about ED-initiated buprenorphine. I mean, I think most of kind of what I view as my goal and as my job is to talk to physicians and emergency medicine personnel and community members and media, and I mean, just treatment works. There's evidence-based treatment that works if we can just facilitate the transfer of patients from the emergency department to treatment. You know, they can get better.
You and I were talking about how when someone comes in with a heart attack to an emergency room, that it's very easy for the doctors and nurses involved to see that as, this could be my mother, this could be my grandfather. You do your best because you can see yourself in that situation. Do you think that's always true when an overdose victim is brought in?
I think it's absolutely not true, and that's actually part of the problem, I think. I think that we, you know, often, you know, when we're providing care for patients, you should obviously provide excellent care to every single person that you see, but there are some people you may relate to more than others, and I think that people have a hard time, you know, when they're providing immediate post-overdose care to a patient. They don't necessarily think, what if this was my brother, or what if this was my cousin, or my parent, or my child? And I think people are more likely to do that with other diseases, and I think it affects the care that people get.
Speaking of stigma, I want to ask the two of you a question. I'll start with you since you're from Ohio, but there were statements made about, from two Ohio officials, or from Ohio officials, about changes they wanted to make in protocols for treating overdose victims. Can you, Tammy, talk about what that person said and what you think about that?
Sure. In recent news, there was a sheriff in the southern part of Ohio, I believe, who made reference to the fact that he was not going to allow his officers to carry naloxone. In Ohio, every sheriff is allowed to do, you know, pretty much anything they want to do within their jurisdiction. You know, I'm very proud of the sheriff that I actually work for, Sheriff Tharp, you know, with taking the initiative to start DART. Here in our county, you know, he's made sure that, you know, all of his employees have had access to training for naloxone. That's 525 of us. Out of the 525, it's 490, like 498, 490, something like that, that are actually carrying naloxone. The ones that aren't carrying it would be the administrative specialists, you know, individuals that are working within the office. But they do have access to it within the facility. In addition to that, every jurisdiction, every municipality within Lucas County, all of them are carrying naloxone. So that goes from library officers to park rangers, to the smallest municipality, you know, which might be Whitehouse, to the largest, which is Toledo Police Department. On any given day, you know, individuals are given naloxone. TPD, Toledo Police Department, is probably initiating, you know, at least 10 to 20 a day per shift.
What do you think of those, of sort of that line of thinking? You know, we've revived you a couple times, and now
Not anymore. Yeah, there was so I believe there was a councilman also in Ohio that was speaking of doing almost like a 3 strikes and you're out strategy, where you only reverse or revive somebody twice, and then on the third time you don't send help. And I don't know the man personally, so I'm not going to speak to the content of his character, but I believe that that proposal is nothing short of reckless. You know, I personally believe that every life is worth saving, no matter how many times it takes, that recovery is absolutely possible, that addiction is not a moral failing, and that every opioid overdose is an opportunity for us to not only save a life, but to steer that life towards recovery.
Education.
And so when that first overdose that I reversed meant the world to me. And when I ended up back in that person's house 2 years later and found him in cardiac arrest, it hurt. And we did everything that we could in order to revive him, and we weren't able to. And the images of him in those final moments stick with me the same way that the images of my brother do. And I think the councilman missed many things, but one particular one stands out to me, and that is that addicts don't just appear out of thin air, disappear one day without a sound, and then somehow end up on a balance sheet somewhere. These people were brought into the world by parents. They form bonds with family and friends as they grow. And when one of these individuals falls, so goes a network of people. Mm-hmm. And I don't believe that I don't care if you're a councilman, I don't care if you have a badge on your chest, if you have a fancy education or a fancy title, I don't think anybody has the right to withhold a life-saving medication.
Speaking of that life-saving medication that we've mentioned so many times, we have the honor of having Dr. Phil Skolnick in the audience with us today. Dr. Skolnick, there you are. I thought that was you, okay. Dr. Skolnick spearheaded the National Institute on Drug Abuse's partnership that developed the naloxone nasal spray, and it's now widely available, as we've been discussing. And so first of all, Dr. Skolnick, we want to thank you for your incredible work. We also wanted to ask you if you could speak briefly about what's in the pipeline to help people who are dealing with addiction.
One of the reasons why NIDA many years ago established a division of therapeutics is because drug companies really have not been invested in developing drugs to treat addictions, not only opiate use disorders, but alcohol use disorders, even smoking. When you think about the number of drugs that we have for smoking, compared and the amount of money that's invested, it's quite modest compared with the secondary consequences. We have drugs to treat lung cancer, emphysema, blood pressure meds are all in development. So there are a number of, I think the opiate epidemic has a dark side, obviously, but the bright side is it's really woken some not all pharma, but some facets of the pharmaceutical industry understand that we may, in fact, be able to do better. So one really exciting development that occurred a couple of months ago was the approval of buprenorphine implants. These are rods that are implanted, and they last for about 6 months. So if you get someone in to have these implants, they make one good decision at that moment, and they're not confronted with daily decisions to take Suboxone, for example. There are other medications, and I think when we think about what are at the roots of, I'll just limit, what are at the roots of the opiate epidemic, you have to think about the pain epidemic and about the overuse of opioids, which are legitimate and wonderful pain medications, and they have legitimate uses. But imagine if we had medications that could be as effective as opioids in treating pain, both acute and chronic pain, but were not addictive, that were non-opioid medicines. And I think that's what we hope to see in basic research in the next 10 to 20 years. So that to me are the most exciting things that are on the horizon now.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Skolnick. And I am afraid we have run out of time, but many thanks to all of you for sharing your experiences, both personal and professional, and all of your insights. And with the good work of people like you, we'll hopefully make inroads into combating this terrible epidemic. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. And while you catch your breath, before the next panel, I'd like to add my thanks to our remarkable panelists, Nathan and Tammy and Jonathan and Dr. Hawk. And to Dr. Skolnick, thank you for your remarkable work. And, well, as this university knows, you're one of this university's many illustrious alumni, and we're really appreciative of your work and the opportunity for us to be here. this evening. Let's move on now to our next panelists. I hope they're over there in the wings. Here they come. I will refer you once again to the program for the detailed information on their backgrounds, but I'll go ahead and ask you to help me welcome them one at a time, starting with Charlotte Wessington, a retired elementary school teacher and the advocate who initiated Kentucky's Matthew Casey Wessington Act for Substance Use Intervention. Charlotte? And my dear friend, fellow traveler, and colleague from the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation, our Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Marvin Sepala. Come on, Marv. Hey, man. And finally, Carolyn Hardin, the Chief of Training and Research for the National Association of Drug Court Professionals, who lives right here in our nation's capital. Let's give them all a round of applause. And Elizabeth, I turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. So first of all, welcome on stage. I'm so glad to have the three of you here with us. Our first panel, we talked about persuasive bridges to care, how to make people feel safe and in a place where they could take that next step towards recovery. And with these three wonderful people, we're going to be talking about compulsory bridges to care. Usually we think of compulsory bridges to care for things like 72-hour holds for psychiatric patients. We don't usually think of it in the addiction arena. And there are some who think that maybe we should start thinking about them in this arena. And so let's start with you, Charlotte. Let's talk before we start talking about the incredible work that you've done in Kentucky. Let's talk about your son, Casey, who is on your pendant.
Yes. Thank you, Elizabeth. I never pass up an opportunity to talk about Casey because, like all moms, we like to talk about our children. And I'd like you to know that Casey was a loving son and grandson and a good friend. He had some of his favorites were skateboarding and music and his beloved dog, Zoe. And everyone who knew Casey appreciated his talents, his contagious laugh, his winsome smile, and his witty sense of humor. Casey enjoyed a lot of things in life until the disease of addiction. And the disease of addiction robbed him of his ability to enjoy anything. And so after that, when addiction did come to our house, we did not know what to do. We were uninformed and we were misinformed. The first inclination that I had was to contact a doctor because that's what I'd always done, Elizabeth, when he was sick. You know, I would contact the doctor. When I did that, I was wished good luck. A counselor said that he thought that Casey was the kind of kid that liked to walk on the edge, but he didn't think he'd ever go over the edge. And then there was the counselor who never had seen Casey who said, I don't think Casey's as addicted as he wants us to believe. Everyone, lay and professionals alike, repeated the same message to us over and over again, and that was that Casey had to want to, lose enough, and hit bottom. When he did say that he wanted help, he went to a treatment facility, but after 6 days of detox, he was wanting to leave, excuse me, and so we had asked that they do an intervention. They refused because they said if he didn't want to, it wasn't going to do any good. So the first overdose that he had, he was released, even though he had been on life support. The second overdose, when we got to the hospital, there was a nurse there that was trying to share her story of recovery with him. And finally, she looked up at me and she said, honey, he's still too young. He hasn't lost enough yet. And I said to her, not knowing how prophetic the words were going to be, what if he doesn't live to be old? It was after the second overdose that we actually had a glimmer of hope, and that was through the criminal justice system, because Casey finally did get arrested, something that we had hoped would happen. When he did, he was released on his own recognizance with a warning that he could receive a summons within 90 days. He got that summons. I still carry it with me now wherever I go. Thank you, Dr. Seppel. As a reminder of that day, the day of his funeral, when this summons arrived at our door. So it was at that point that we could make some decisions for Casey. They asked us if we wanted to have a feeding tube put in. We said yes. Did we want a cage put in his lung to capture any blood clots that might develop? We said yes. And then finally, the only option that we were left with was, did we want to turn off the life support? And of course, we did not. But at that point in time, there was no hope for Casey, because what I say now is about the bottom line is this: people have to be alive to recover. So after Casey passed away, I called the courthouse where he had been arrested, and I spoke to a lady on the phone, and when I told her who I was calling about, she said, well, we have a warrant out for his arrest. And I said, well, good luck. He's at Spring Grove Cemetery today. And I told her what I had hoped that the judge would do, that he would order treatment for Casey. And she said, well, you don't understand how the system works. And I thought, well, yes, I do understand how the system doesn't work. And at that point in time, I decided that maybe, just maybe, I could do something to change the system so that other families did not have to go through the horrific challenge of trying to get help for their loved ones.
Tell me about that law that you got passed in Kentucky.
Casey's Law was a result of that, and the law is an Involuntary Treatment Act that allows parents, relatives, and/or friends to petition the court on behalf of someone who has a substance use disorder. That's regardless of age, and it's without any criminal charges. It starts with filing a petition in the circuit clerk's office, and it requires that 2 evaluations be done by 2 qualified health professionals. One of them has to be a doctor. The process has to be done within 14 days, and there is a hearing, and the judge will, using those evaluations, determine how long that person will be in treatment, and it can be for up to 360 days.
Wow. Might this have saved your son?
I believe so. I mean, we'll never know, Elizabeth, you know. I mean, even if he had been arrested, and I mean, even if they'd ordered him to treatment through the court, there are no guarantees. But what I do know is that it could have given Casey a glimpse of what recovery can look like. And what I know is so important with recovery of any kind is hope. Hope that things can be different and that it can be better.
So many other parents are facing the same challenge that you faced, and some mothers came here with you.
Yes.
Can you introduce them?
I would be glad to introduce my cohorts. I call them my posse. They are wonderful ladies, and ladies, would you please stand? Kimberly Wright on the end is the administrator of Kentucky Parents Against Heroin, and she has a daughter in recovery, and I'm happy to say that her daughter is in recovery in part because of Casey's Law. Holly Specht is the mom of Nicholas, and Holly's family has done incredible work. One of the barriers that Holly faced was when Nicholas would go to the hospital, she might get a little piece of paper with a few facilities written down on a slip of paper, and when she would investigate, some of them would be closed. It was not a good scene. And so their first mission was to come up with this guide. And I believe, Holly, if I'm not mistaken, over 30,000 have been given out. So other families hopefully will have the resources at hand that they need. And by the way, that's nkyhatesheroin.com, and it is an online resource guide. And then we have Joan Arlinghouse, and Joan's daughter is also in recovery, and she is another committed advocate. I don't know what I would do without them, so I thank them all the time, but publicly, you guys know how much I love you and how much I appreciate all that you do.
Charlotte, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for all of that and for all that you've done for people in Kentucky. Dr. Sepala, when you hear about what Charlotte's done in Kentucky, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's fantastic because people with addiction don't recognize they have this problem. When you look at the national statistics, 85% of people don't seek addiction treatment because they don't know they have an illness. They don't know they have a problem. They don't recognize it, and it's explained neurobiologically by the very parts of the brain that are affected by addiction. And so if we can't recognize we have a problem, we can't seek help for it. And even when people come into treatment, myself included, when I entered treatment, I argued that I didn't belong there. And most people do. And if we can't do something, in the form of a civil commitment, in some way of pressuring people to enter treatment. In fact, most people are there because of something. It's either family, the courts, their job that have forced the issue. But not everyone has that opportunity to have a law like this that allows for treatment, but also for that length of treatment is absolutely tremendous.
Can you tell us, when you were 17 and facing addiction, struggling with addiction, how did compulsory treatment play a role for you?
I think it was a con or a scam.
Your parents conned you.
So my parents brought me to Hazelden, where I work now, and I was a 17-year-old high school dropout, and I went in with a counselor, and actually he elicited some history for me that I did actually use drugs and alcohol, something I'd never admit to anybody, let alone my family. And then they took me out and said I had to sign these papers to stay in treatment, and I said, absolutely not, I am not staying here. And in the back of my mind was, I won't get high today if I stay here, this is not good. And my father said, if you don't stay here, we're all gonna meet in court, and you'll be here anyway. And I don't believe that could have worked, although I asked my boss, Mark Mishik, our president and CEO, who's an attorney, and he said it may have worked, but I don't think it would have in 1974. But it did result in my signing the papers and staying. And although I didn't stay sober from that, I didn't get sober till 19, but it made a huge difference because I got really good treatment at a young age at a necessary point in my life.
Right, that's amazing. As a psychiatrist, you have used 72-hour holds on patients frequently, I assume, over the years. They are usually used for people who are a threat to themselves or others. What do you think about the use of a 72-hour hold for someone facing addiction?
I think it makes a lot of sense because often we're seeing people that have had numerous overdoses. I certainly hear of families in which a death has occurred. We have people that leave treatment, that relapse, overdose, ultimately death occurs. And when a person can't recognize the risk that they're taking and can't care for their own safety, and addiction reprioritizes the reward center of the brain in such a way that survival becomes less important than continued use of the drug. I mean, I risked my life repeatedly. We all do in the midst of addiction, and it's just part of what goes on. But if you're having overdoses to the point that death could be imminent, use of a 72-hour hold could result in good evaluation and then some decision-making about long-term treatment. And hopefully some of the earlier interventions that were described in the prior panel would work for people, but that's not going to be the case often enough. So we need such means of forcing the issue in a way to care for the individual. We would do that for anyone else with a psychiatric illness. Unfortunately, although 37 states in the District of Columbia have laws allowing for this, most of them aren't used for addiction. And a lot of judges won't go down this path because there's not much in the way of case law or precedent for this.
When you speak at conferences, maybe conferences even like this, where I think probably the thinking is much more along the lines of the first panelists, do people ever disagree with you? Do they say compulsory? You know, this sort of sounds a bit like an arrest. Is this really the route we want to go down?
It's a really difficult decision, and great care has to be taken in removing freedom from anybody. And so it would have to be well thought out, and the laws associated with it would have to be extremely well written so it couldn't be abused or misused in ways to force treatment when it wasn't necessary. But I think it would save lives, and that's the real intent of such law.
If I had asked you this, if we were talking about this earlier in your career, if I had said, Dr. Sepala, what do you think about 72-hour holds for people facing addiction? Would you be saying this, or would you be saying something different?
You know, when I first went into psychiatry, it seemed extremely odd to be able to take away someone's freedom and force treatment, especially to be able to force medication. However, what I saw was the life-saving aspect of it over time, sometimes within that 72 hours, to see people who are frankly suicidal realize out of a temporary situation that they did not want to die, or to see a civil commitment that resulted in, forced treatment, a very difficult decision, forcing medication. And it changed my mind over time because I saw life saved. But initially, no, that just, I'd err on the side of civil liberties, but not to that degree anymore.
That's interesting. I guess your thinking can change over time on these kinds of things.
I'm older.
You're older. You're further away from that 17-year-old kid.
That's right.
I guess, right? So, Carolyn, you do work with drug courts. Can you talk a little bit about what, you hear that term a lot, but what exactly does it mean?
So, drug courts is an alternative to incarceration for people with substance use disorders. They developed essentially out of the cocaine epidemic of the 80s and 90s. And instead of viewing addiction as a moral failing, something you should be punished for, drug courts brought public health approach to treat it as a disease within the criminal justice system. And so today, where we look at drug courts kind of wanted to move at it at a compassionate way as opposed to just punishment. So how do we address this issue? Today, there are 3,192 drug courts in operation across the country that are designed not just for adult offenders, but repeat DWI offenders. We have family dependency courts that work with reunification issues for kids who've been removed from the home, juveniles, and we also have our latest iteration of veterans treatment courts. So the model has expanded greatly to other types.
So when someone is arrested on a drug-related charge, drug court is an option. It's not mandatory, right?
Drug court is an option. And just keep this in mind. It is not just a drug-related charge, so to speak. Sometimes people think, oh, it's just for drug crimes. No, it is drug-driven crimes. We see a number of folks who are involved in the system who are stealing, forgery, and all they're trying to do is, guess what? support that drug habit. So those are the folks that we really want in our drug court program.
So drug court is one option. What's the other option presented
So
to them?
yes, drug court is one option. You know, people always talk about it, and when we talk to clients, we'll tell them. So you have a choice. You know, drug court is not for low-level offenders. It is really geared toward folks who are on their way to prison. And so you might be looking at 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And you can, as I always tell them, you can have door number 1, door number 2. Door number 2 offers you treatment. Door number 1 offers you 10 to 15. So there's a choice.
I would think, faced with door number 1 versus door number 2, that people would choose the drug court over the prison sentence. But is that always the case?
That is not always the case. We have a number of people who will rather do their time as opposed to go to drug court. Sometimes, for many of them, it is easier to stay in their addiction as opposed to go to treatment to address that.
And in prison, they can continue their addiction?
Yes, some of them will. Many of them will. And when you look at the studies, you see that a number of folks coming out of our jails and prisons end up going back to their use.
When someone goes into a drug court, they're given treatment. And then once they're done with treatment, they're done. How does that work?
Okay, so when you come in drug court, there's a whole lot of things. It's a team approach. So you have a judge and this other team members, a prosecutor, a defense attorney, treatment providers, probation, and law enforcement. And you bring together this team, and generally each week the client is coming back to court. Not only do they go to treatment, but we're doing home visits. We're doing drug testing at a minimum of 2 to 3 times a week. Someone's coming to your house, someone is seeing you. And the great thing is that generally most people go to treatment, they get 30 to 60 days. Most of the folks who come in our drug courts, because it's geared at those folks who are at that substance addiction end, you know, those far in there. Our people in our programs 18 to 24 months. Wow. And during that time, they're getting treatment and access to treatment. And I also want to say, not only are we talking about treatment, but our treatment comes along with aftercare, continuing care. What happens is that many folks think, well, when you get treatment, you're good. No. This is when we really need to give them other services to make sure that they have the tools that they need. And the one thing that we're doing with drug courts is making sure that drug courts are pushing recovery. For so long, they used to just want to get people sober. That's not our mission. Our mission is to introduce folks to this journey of recovery so that they're addressing everything.
And what kind of success have drug courts had?
So one of the great things about drug courts, it's a plus and a minus, but we kind of look at it as a plus. It is the most researched criminal justice program in our system today. And so there was a study done by the National Institute of Justice called the Multi-Site Adult Drug Court Evaluation. And the one thing that the evaluation showed was that drug courts reduce crime and they save money. And so that's a good win. The other thing is that they reunify families. So children stayed less time in foster care when they were connected with the family dependency treatment courts. We also have our number of studies that show with our DWI repeat offenders and high BAC population, we see 50 to 60% reduction in recidivism when they go through a DWI program as opposed to just getting no treatment or sometimes minimal treatment. So we see that we have impact. Not only that, is that our folks who go through drug courts are employed now, and they have jobs, they're going back to school, and we've seen high increases of that. So when you talk about them doing recovery, we now are helping folks to become independent and self-supportive.
That's wonderful. Dr. Seppala, Hazelden is coming out with a report later this month on involuntary commitment laws. Can you give us an overview of sort of where we are with those kinds of laws across the country?
I mentioned earlier there are 37 states in the District of Columbia have such laws, but they aren't adequate. So we want to have a reexamination of this across the country and see if we can introduce it in all states. And they really range from a single day up to a full year, like in Kentucky. So they're remarkably different by states. It's completely inadequate at this point, and most of them aren't used. So we want to bring attention to this issue and see if we can help to institute much better laws in all 50 states.
It's interesting. It sounds in Kentucky like that they aren't afraid of using Casey's law, that it does get used.
It does get used in a number of counties. However, there are counties that are underutilizing Casey's law. And part of the reason for that is a lack of education. They don't know about it. Even Casey's law has been in effect now for 13 years. But there are still counties that really don't know anything about it. And we have some judges who are holding on to the belief that a person has to want treatment for it to work and are actually not allowing families to file petitions. So there are some obstacles, there are some barriers to the law, but those ladies and I travel the state and try to educate people about the law and raise awareness about it so that families have that option.
Take me through the mechanics of it a little bit. If, let's say, a parent is concerned about a child, what do they report and who do they report it to?
Well, there is a petition that comes from the Administrative Office of the Courts in Frankfurt, and they fill out that petition and put in there all the substantiating evidence that they have about why they think that their loved one has a substance use disorder, why they think that they are a danger to themselves and to others, and need and can benefit from treatment. And then after that, they file that petition and report to the clerk who the evaluators are, and then the appointments have been made. They go to the appointments with their loved one. This is an affidavit that is notarized, and so it is returned to the court at least 24 hours, no later than 24 hours before the court hearing. The respondent has an attorney that's appointed to them to protect their rights, and there's a hearing within 14 days, and most of the time it's a lot sooner than that. And at that point in time, the judge will look at those evaluations and decide whether or not this person needs and can benefit from treatment, and if they are in fact a danger to themselves and others, and then he will order treatment accordingly.
And the treatment lasts, you were saying?
It can last up to 360 days.
Wow.
But that doesn't mean that everybody who is ordered to treatment will have that kind of order.
Do we know how many people have been committed through Casey's law?
You know, it's been really difficult, Elizabeth, to get the real numbers, because it seems like that, and I've been in touch with the counties and also with the Administrative Office of the Courts, and it seems like the courts are reporting one thing and the AOC does not have the same numbers. However, looking at the last report from their office in Frankfurt, from 2010 to 2016, there were like over 300 judgments for treatment. So we know that it is being used, not as widely as we would like, but certainly every family that has been able to use it has been grateful for that option.
Dr. Seppel, if you could, we're almost out of time here, but if you could sum up, there are many young people in recovery in our audience. You were once a young person in recovery. In the light of what we've been talking about here with compulsory treatments, what message might you have for them?
You know, I'd say that to bring hope to those folks that are seeking recovery, and even those folks that don't know they're seeking or need recovery, your example can be just tremendous for people that don't know that there is another way to lead their lives and they don't have to be stuck in the throes of addiction. And how wonderful it is to have the support of a lot of other people in recovery. And and just how life-changing that can be. Because so much of what I experienced early in recovery, even though I didn't have the support of other people my age, was just the love of other people that buoyed me up and put me on a path that I could not have described. I mean, I had a real low bar for my life when I first got into recovery, and it didn't include a job like this.
Well, you are a great example of what one can do with recovery and after recovery. So thank you, all three of you, so much for joining us. Thank you. Thank you.
Great job.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Charlotte and Dr. Seppala and Carolyn, for your inspiring words and your knowledge, your expertise, and you're willing to share it with us today. At this time, it is my honor to introduce Senator Amy Klobuchar. Senator Klobuchar was a lead sponsor on the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, CARA, and is one of the great supporters of addiction prevention and recovery in Washington. I can tell you firsthand that she has also been very active back in Minnesota, raising awareness about the opioid overdose epidemic, facilitating conversations among many stakeholders, and pursuing solutions in our communities and at every level of government. Senator Klobuchar is the first woman to be elected to the United States Senate from Minnesota, and she previously served as the county attorney for Hennepin County, Minnesota's largest. We deeply appreciate her work not just on CARA, but on issues like strengthening prescription drug monitoring programs and stopping illegal opioid shipments through the Postal Service. One more thing. Just like Senator Whitehouse, Senator Klobuchar is our senator from Minnesota, but when it comes to the issues and to the solutions that bring us here this evening, Senator Klobuchar is our United States Senator. Help me welcome Senator Amy Klobuchar. Thank you, Senator.
Well, thank you so much, William. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for that enthusiasm. And I love being here with Hazleton. I know Mark Mishek is here. And I just saw Dr. Seppala and so many friends. We're pretty proud of Hazleton Betty Ford in Minnesota, and we're proud of the work that we're doing. And it's also good to be away from Capitol Hill for a minute. Yes, I spent my day at the Judiciary Committee. We had the hearing for the newly nominated FBI director, who actually is one of my daughter's best friend's dad. My daughter, like many in the audience, is 22 years old, and you can imagine the text I got when he first got nominated. Mom, you'll never be mean, right? To Caroline's dad. Like, Mom. It would be really embarrassing. Luckily, he did a stupendous job today. And just so you know, there's a little bit of an island. And by the way, I asked about at the hearing about the opioid epidemic. And there a little island of sanity is that Senator Grassley, who chairs the Judiciary Committee, the Republican who chairs it, had to leave for something, and there was only a few senators left, and he had me, a Democrat, chair the last 45 minutes of the Republican nominee for the FBI. So, you know, there is hope, and obviously we've been undergoing a lot of changes in the last 6 months or so. Most traumatic, you may not have noted this, but I was displaced as the most famous Slovenian American in the country by Melania Trump. That happened to me. It's a true story. She was actually born an hour away from where my relatives are from in Slovenia. And as I said at the National Prayer Breakfast, every time I look at her, it's like looking in the mirror. So anyway, so I have overcome this. It has been hard. But mostly what continues to find bipartisan support is support for taking on this epidemic. And a lot of that has to do with the people in this room and the fact that people will not give up, that there are people out there in the treatment community, people who are in families that have been affected by this, people who have been addicted themselves that just won't give up and believe that there's a better way to handle this, a better way to make sure people get treatment and to make sure that we stop people from getting addicted in the first place. I want to, first of all, say this maybe for me, I wouldn't have gotten involved in this as much, except that I'm from Minnesota, a state where, in the words of Garrison Keillor, to paraphrase him, all the women are strong, right? All the men are good looking. And all of the treatment advocates are above average, okay? You heard from Nathan earlier, the Hennepin County paramedic who told his powerful story. You heard from Jonathan Goyer, who uses his own experience with addiction to help others and manages Rhode Island's Anchor More program. Or Tammy Smith, a forensics counselor in Lucas County, Ohio, in the sheriff's office, who goes out to help people who are struggling with addiction. Those are advocates, right? Maybe they're not all running for office, but they're just as important as those of us that do, because they're able to get the word out in a way, especially at a time where you don't have a lot of trust in that place over on the Hill. It's really important to have advocates out there. So I don't have to tell you all the facts. You certainly know them, and if you didn't, you've already learned them tonight at this town hall. But I always like to put them in more graphic terms. When you have 50 people dying a day from opioid abuse and opioid addiction and overdoses, that is literally 2 classrooms a day. 2 classrooms a day of people. In our state, it's more people have died in the last year from overdose from opioids than we had people die from homicides or than we had people die from car crashes. I sat with parents who have lost a child to an overdose, parents like Shelley Elkington. Her daughter, Casey Jo, was a champion swimmer who hoped to study nursing like her mom. In 2008, she was diagnosed with Crohn's disease, painful complications. She gets prescription opioids. You've heard this story before. She gets addicted and ends up dying. It literally hijacked her life. Heard stories of 12-year-old kids who are out at a park and some guys come up to them and say, hey, I will give you a 6-pack of beer. This is in a small town in Minnesota. If you go back to your parents' medicine cabinet and their friend's medicine cabinet and you find these drugs, and they wrote them down on a piece of paper, you come back with one of those, we'll give you this 6-pack. That's happening. Pushers, 12-year-olds. Or people like Prince, right? Superstar in our state, the superstar next door, even someone who had grown to the highest heights in the music industry, who is just an icon, couldn't cope with that addiction and died. So it's not just people you haven't heard of, it is everyone, and everyone has a story. And that's why in our state, whenever I talk about what happened to Prince, I make sure I mention that champion swimmer or the mom in Duluth. Think about what has been taken from us with this epidemic. Who knows how many patients Casey Jo could have treated if she'd been able to be a nurse, how many songs Prince had left to write, how many inventors and innovators and teachers and first responders we have lost to this epidemic. It has to stop. So I look at this in a few ways. One William mentioned, and that's I used to be a prosecutor, and so I saw how so many of our cases involved people who had gotten hooked on drugs. And, I always would tell people we want to be more efficient in government, but there's one way we're not like a business. We don't like to see repeat customers. And the one way you can make sure you don't see repeat customers in the criminal justice system is if you get them the treatment that they need. I also come from this in a personal way. My dad was a well-known columnist. He's still around, but he wrote for years and years for the newspaper. He's a big adventurer. I literally saw him climb the highest mountains, but go to the lowest valleys because of his addiction to drinking and alcohol. And he had gotten some charges back in the 70s when it didn't matter much for DUI-type related charges. And they just kind of go, okay, fine. And then it was later, actually the same year I got married in 1993, that he got a charge. And by the 90s, it was more serious. And so he had jail time hanging over his head, and he had to go to treatment. And in his words, that was when he was pursued by grace. He wrote a book about it called Pursued by Grace. And he chose a different way. And at 89, he's still sober. So there you go. So it was that, like so many people, that combination of the personal as well as the work that I'd done that brought me to work on this issue. When I got to the Senate, and I know you heard from my pal Sheldon, we worked together along with Rob Portman of Ohio and Kelly A. out of New Hampshire on that comprehensive bill that really set a framework nationally and brought this to the attention of many people. So we got that passed, and that was really cool, and it wouldn't have happened without people in this room and a lot of people that worked hard on it. But I think you all know it was just a beginning. It kind of like set the stage, right? And now comes the hard work of implementing it and doing things like making sure that people can get the treatment that we want them to get in that bill. Now, we did put a bunch of money, and I just saw former Vice President Biden yesterday, and in that America Cures Act, we got $1 billion in there for treatment, and that's really important. That's real money. But we're going to have to do even more. I personally like Senator Manchin's bill, the Lifeboat Act, which holds pharmaceutical companies accountable, and it has a fee that's charged on all of the percentage of the opioids, and then that fee goes directly into treatment, right? So it's basically holding the companies that have been profiting off of this somewhat responsible for this. It's not like a lawsuit, it's nothing, it just says, okay, help for the treatment. We know this was, got a lot of people addicted. So that's a piece of it, the treatment part. And I heard, as I was standing waiting, you were talking about drug courts, and I've been leading that effort to expand them across the country. I took that over from actually when Ted Kennedy died. I'm a big believer in drug courts from what I've seen when I was county attorney. But some of this is going to be preventing addiction in the first place. It's everything from getting those drugs out of the medicine cabinets and making it easier to return used drugs to drugstores and places like that. We've made some progress on that. And then it's also decreasing the number of people that get prescribed opioids. You've all heard the stories of emergency rooms, people going in and then getting hooked for life. Last year, I actually talked to a rehab counselor in Moorhead, Minnesota, across the river from Fargo. They call it Fargo Moorhead. We call it Moorhead Fargo. But he had a patient who had 100, when they looked at his record, 108 prescriptions for painkillers from more than 85 different prescribers in 50 different cities. And that's why I have introduced a bill to make mandatory prescription drug monitoring. So you have to share the data across state lines. And I got Rob Portman of Ohio is doing the bill with me. Now, we set the stage again in the CARE Act, but we would like to see that be a requirement across the country. Because I don't think you can ever get to where we want to be if when you have health professionals that don't have all the information in front of them. I've seen them cry in front of me when they tell the story of someone who ended up dying that they didn't even know was hooked. Changing the prescription guidelines, looking at alternative painkillers. You know all the things that we can do to stop people from getting hooked. And then the last piece of this, as we see a decrease, which we started to see in the number of prescriptions, we know what's going to happen to people who are already addicted if they don't get the treatment they need. A lot of them are turning, as you know, to less expensive illegal drugs. 4 out of 5 heroin users got their start actually on prescription drugs. So we have to also look at that, and some of this is making it harder to ship these illegal synthetics in. That's the bill I have with Senator Portman's bill on checking things better in the mail, making it easier to prosecute these cases with fentanyl, carfentanil, which is 100 times more potent than fentanyl, 10,000 times more potent than morphine, an amount the size of a speck of sand can kill you. These things should not be transported. They should not be transported across and be for sale in America, and that's why we have to do something about that. And then finally, just keeping up this fight by how we talk about it and reminding people of the stories, that it's not just numbers. It is not just the percentages of people that get addicted and all those things you hear. It's people you know, it's friends, it's neighbors, it's people in your own family. You are the advocates for this, the advocates for addiction treatment, the backbone of the effort. And you don't just have to take my word for it. First Lady Betty Ford, she once said, she talked about, really at that time, it was pretty amazing when she came out, remember, and told her story, announcing that addiction was part of her life. And then she dedicated herself to fighting the stigma of admitting that you're addicted. She once said that what we're here on this earth for is to help others. And if you can, you ought to do it. I think that's some pretty simple advice. I think some people on the Hill need that advice right now, but that is pretty simple advice. So I want to remind you of that. Thank you for what you're doing. And since it's a town hall meeting, you have to ask me a few questions. So I'd be happy to take some questions. Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. So we're actually a little bit ahead of schedule before we bring our panel back, and we do have a couple of questions for you. One of the questions that we have here is, look, when we all leave here, we're going to go back to our respective states. Some of us are going to go back to Minnesota, where we'll see you, but others are going to go back to their places. What is the most effective activity that we can do to influence the debate with your colleagues on both sides of the aisle in Congress?
Well, I think you've really done an amazing thing. If you look at this recent debate about the Medicaid funding cuts, what was one of the first things you heard members of Congress talk about when they talked about why they were concerned about it? Did you notice? They talked about opioid overdoses. They talked about opioid addiction. It was given by a number of people in the Senate on both sides of the aisle as one of the reasons they were concerned about the cut, because so many people get their treatment through Medicaid. And so that's an example of having real power when people look at that as one of the reasons and they feel comfortable citing it to their constituents, some of whom have people who've been addicted in their families, some of them don't. You have brought this issue to the stage where people are feeling comfortable saying it. I know that sounds like a kind of a wimpy answer, but a lot of things. The other thing I think people pointed to was seniors, right? That you've heard a lot of people talk about seniors and healthcare and da-da-da. But added to this time was opioid abuse and opioid addiction and the concern that we don't have enough funding to pay for that. So I think the fact that we've gotten it to that level is an incredible thing. And just telling the stories, working across the aisle, even if you don't really agree with someone, being willing to go up to them at events and say, hey, this is something that's happened to me. Thank you for supporting this, or I want you to support this, and being polite about it. Yes, letters matter. Responding to putting things out on social media with tweets, nice tweets, nice tweets, and Facebook posts. I think those really matter, even telling those stories. So that's one side of it that I think you all know. But actually the face-to-face contact of coming up, finding out you're a member of Congress or a legislature or something is going to be at some picnic or something, and just being willing to show up and talk to them. It's not always just trying to see them in Washington. You can meet with their staff. That's really important. You won't always meet with them. I have a constituent breakfast tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Welcome to come. We serve pizza. That's a Slovenian treat. But it's trying to find your way into those situations so you can talk to members is really important.
One more question here from...
Yes, go right ahead. Thank you for all you've done. Could you tell us about the possible actual appropriations in this difficult budgetary year? I know we've had the authorizations, but what are the chances of getting real appropriations this year?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that we actually did get some money. That was really real money last year with that Cures Act. And now the issue is, because the original bill wasn't the real money, that was just the framework. But now what we're concerned about are the budget cuts that have been proposed in what's been called the skinny budget. I don't like it. It sounds too nice. But that budget that was proposed by the administration makes some significant cuts. And while there is money in there for opioid treatment, the issue is that it makes so many other cuts that could bring us backwards. And I think that's most illustrated by these healthcare proposals, where 32% of treatment in my state, treatment funding, comes from Medicaid. So that's very concerning. I will say in the budget for this year, which was a normal budget, and it was done by all four leaders, which is McConnell and Schumer and Ryan and Pelosi, and they were able to negotiate it despite the budget that had come out from the White House for the next year. So I'm hoping that that can happen again, and just continuing to push the treatment issue is going to be very, very important. Because as I reminded Governor Christie, who heads up the commission on opioids, I went over there and he had a nice meeting. We spoke about things that he one time at the end of an election had said that you should go not just where it's comfortable, but go where it's uncomfortable. I always like that. I used it. And I think that's part of what we all need to do, and what you're going to need to do as you advocate for these appropriations and do what we can, because I don't think people ever thought we'd actually be as far as we are. I know that sounds hard to hear when you have someone who died in your family or you've been struggling with an addiction, but in the scheme of what has been a really difficult time in our history, this issue has emerged. This issue is, I don't think there's anyone that doesn't know about it or hear about it that works in government, and that's really important. And so the key is to kind of not give up. Even if you get disheartened by things. My friend Tammy Baldwin from Wisconsin was saying the other day, it's like, on New Year's Eve and you get a new pair of tennis shoes and then you make a promise that you're going to go running every single day, and then 3 months later you can't even find where you put the tennis shoes, right? Okay, we can't let that happen, right? You can't, just because it feels sometimes somewhat difficult because these proposals come out that would move us backwards instead of forwards. Your response has to be to just fight even harder and keep up the fight, because there are people there that have your back, and I am honored to be one of them. So thank you very much.
In these unpredictable, tiring, long days in Washington, Senator Amy Klobuchar honored her commitment and was with us tonight despite it all. Let's give her one more round of applause. Thank you, Senator, very much. I'll see you back in the district. Okay. Okay. You guys have been behaving pretty well so far, and we're almost done here. We have a few more minutes yet. I want to ask Elizabeth and all 7 of our panelists now, please, to come back to center stage, where Elizabeth will lead us in some Q&A and some follow-up conversation. So at this time, please, let's have the panelists come back. Here comes the doctor carrying his own chair. That's unusual to see that, Dr. Sepula. Very good. Usually I'm carrying his chair for him. Okay, and this is going to be your chance to ask some questions too. So remember, it's #OpioidTownHall for those who know how to do that on social media. You got it, Elizabeth?
Yeah, sorry,
Okay.
it took us a minute because we were all having so much fun talking amongst ourselves in the back that we sort of forgot to come out. So here we are, and we have some wonderful questions from all of you as well as from folks on social media. And Jonathan, I want to start with you. This literally has your name on it. What are we not getting right or doing enough of in addressing this crisis?
So that's a tough question to answer. I'll bring 2 points to that. Number one, contrary to the name of this event, we are not actually in an opioid overdose crisis. That is not what we are in. What we are experiencing is an addiction epidemic of colossal proportion in this country. And until we recognize that and until we react to that, we are just extinguishing small fires here. The other component is bringing people that are in recovery to the table. right? So we have a tendency in this country to employ every doctor, scientist, and astronaut and ask them what it is that we should do. But the reality is that 25 million Americans have found recovery from drugs and alcohol, and their voices need to be at the table. And how many people are in recovery here? Raise your hand, right? Right? So it's our job as people in recovery to leave here and find our local substance abuse task force, our local prevention coalitions, and join them. If we're not invited, it is our job to show up and join them. If we are given 2 minutes to talk, it is our job to take 3 minutes to talk, right? And if our voices aren't being heard, it's our job to talk louder, because it is up to us to find our way out of this epidemic. We are the living experts of this.
Thank you. Thank you. So an observant viewer mentioned that the CDC does not call it overdose, they call it drug poisoning. Why do some people continue to call it overdose? Basically, does the terminology matter, whether we call it overdose or drug poisoning? Anyone have any thoughts on that?
Man. Yeah, I mean, the CDC is really specific about how they define things. So they look at toxicology, they look at toxicity, and so I can understand them using that kind of terminology, that it's a poisoning. Nonetheless, it is the result of the overdose that causes respiratory depression and ultimately death. So I think they're both useful terms, but maybe in their lexicon and in their way of looking at things, that might be a better term, but I don't know that most people would understand poisoning as well as overdose. So for the public, I think overdose is a better term.
Sure. And the other thing is a lot of CDC, they get their data from hospitals based on billing data and coding data that kind of uses that lexicon and not necessarily overdose. Like ICD-9 was the previous billing iteration, actually didn't have overdose in it. It only had poisoning. And so that's at least part of, I think, their language, because that's where they get their statistics from.
Gotcha. Okay. Tammy, we have a question for you. How are you able to avoid arresting clients even though police are involved?
Well, first of all, I'm not a law enforcement officer,
Right.
so I don't get to arrest anyone. My background is in social work and counseling. However, for those that are within the unit that are law enforcement, if there is an opiate in the system, it is considered to be a violation of the law. But every law enforcement officer has the option to either act on that or not act on that. And in Ohio, specifically in Lucas County, we're choosing not to act upon the actual legal aspect, but to go towards the treatment first.
Okay. This is for anyone who chooses to take this on. How can we hold pharmaceutical companies accountable for their role in the opioid crisis?
I didn't, how can we hold who?
Pharmaceutical companies accountable for their role in the opioid crisis. There are some states that are suing.
State attorney generals are starting to try and figure that out and how they can sue the pharmaceutical companies. I was just in Mississippi yesterday speaking at a conference set up by the attorney general there and for law enforcement, treatment professionals, and politicians, and they are examining that. And there's multiple people examining such lawsuits around the country. So I think we're going to start seeing that very soon, actually.
And there have been some fines levied by, I think, Purdue Pharmaceuticals was levied a $6 million fine for deceptive advertising. But that's small compared to, I think, the damage that we've certainly seen.
Since you've just talked, I'll throw another question your way. See, no good deed goes unpunished. How do patient outcomes for substance use disorder treatments compare to other chronic illness treatments? Do we know that?
So I'm just going to put out there that I actually don't know the answer to that question. But the thing that I do know is that when we think about medical conditions, we don't cure people of hypertension or cure people of diabetes or cure people of heart attacks. We provide treatment for a medical disease and support. And so I think, to think about it as cure rates, which is sort of how I'm interpreting that question, I think, these are chronic medical diseases that deserve treatment, as opposed to a fixed endpoint where, the infection is gone or something like that.
Okay. Jonathan, I have another question, just because this isn't addressed to you, but you sort of mentioned this. How do we integrate harm reduction approaches into the list of options offered to people who overdose? I think what they're referring to is if you're trying to help someone who clearly is going to go on to use, they are not stepping into recovery, how do we introduce harm reduction approaches?
So there are many harm reduction approaches or strategies that somebody can take, and this could be anybody, whether it's a doctor, whether it's a recovery coach, whether it's a family member, to promote ways and means of people doing what they're doing in a more healthy way, once again, so that we can love them until they love themselves. And some of that is making people aware of fentanyl, and that it's out there, and that it's out in counterfeit pills, that it's in cocaine supplies, it's in heroin supplies, to start low and go slow. And the other thing too is not using alone, right? Because these are the people that are dying, the people that are sitting alone somewhere. You could have all the Narcan in the world, but if you're using alone, it's not going to be effective. Nobody's going to be there to call 911. So we can use some of this messaging to promote and have a more real conversation with people, right? Because that's what it's about. It's about having real conversations, real meaningful conversations, even if they're hard ones to have. But it ultimately could result in saving a life.
If I can add a little bit.
Sure, please.
In addition to that, I think needle exchange programs would also be something that a community could actually embrace. And then also just teaching healthy hygiene habits, cleaning up, before and after, unfortunately.
Gotcha. I'm looking around at who might be old enough to remember this phrase, the war on drugs. That was a big thing. I remember growing up hearing about that. The war on drugs, that was how we were going to combat this problem. I'm quoting here from Diane on Twitter. She said, "What is the best way to help legislators understand that the war on drugs has proven ineffective?" Or I guess another way to ask it is, what did we learn from the war on drugs and what it did and didn't do? So do any of you have any thoughts on that, Carolyn?
I actually do. One of the things that we learned that was a residual of the war on drugs was that we incarcerated more people during this war on drugs. And we put people who were addicted to drugs and alcohol in prisons and jails. And we then put ourselves in an overcrowded situation when there is a number of folks that we could have treated in the community with treatment, as opposed to locking them up in our prisons and jails. And we also see a lot of that as it relates to with our mental health population as well. And so if we could get better, if we learn nothing else, that we could not lock people up and make this disease go away. And I think one of the things as we look at what we're seeing now as this rush of our issues is that as I work in the criminal justice side, I'd like to see people not come to our system to get treatment. That if there was treatment readily and available for everybody, that would be great. But one of our issues, and I'll just take a moment to say to those folks in the audience, especially those young folks, that please become counselors. We need you. We need you. We need you. Please become counselors. There's a workforce development issue when we start to talk about how do we combat this issue. And that's one of the things that I think. We have to learn that that war led to this mass incarceration, folks coming out, and even if they still wanted treatment, there was not many places they could go to get it.
Gotcha.
Well, if I could say something about that too. Because before the war on drugs, it was treated more as a disease. And then the war on drugs came, and then it was criminalized. So now we're trying to get back to promoting it as the disease that it is. And it's done so much to stigmatize the illness that's a big barrier for folks as well.
That's an excellent point. Nathan, I have a question for you as a paramedic. Someone wants to know, how can I tell if someone has OD'd when they're unconscious? For example, diabetic coma, cardiac arrest versus overdose?
Sure. So some of the trademark signs and symptoms are respiratory depression, so breathing really slow, pale, cyanotic or blue skin, and there's usually trademark pinpoint pupils. And some history would be involved there too. I mean, most of the people who I know or who I show up on scene with, if they're there and there's an opioid overdose or opioid user, they're usually familiar that there's that kind of a history involved. But I would just say if you ever come across anybody who you randomly find who's near unconscious, just call 911. And we were discussing a little bit back there about how the stigma has, most people who call in, I would say, and this is anecdotal, but half of them, if not more than half of them, when they call 911, they're calling it in as something other than what it actually is. And the reason why is because there's either shame involved there, and that shame's generated by the stigma. So I would encourage anybody to just be honest so that we can deliver the kind of care that's necessary. And as far as I'm concerned, any paramedic worth his or her salt will show up and be non-judgmental and treat the patient as they need to be treated.
Let's see. Dr. Seppala, I know that folks at Hazelden are paying visits to legislators on Capitol Hill tomorrow. So this is a particularly apt question for you. How will programs focused on addiction treatment and recovery be affected by the proposed cuts to Medicaid?
You know, in a word, it'd be terrible, you know, because so many people have had access to treatment and recovery services as a result of the changes based on recent legislation. And to go backward from where we've gotten would be a tragedy, because finally more people, millions more people have access to addiction treatment. And they can stay on, you know, for young people, they stay on their parents' insurance till 26. That's a remarkable change and allows more people access to treatment. So, and also in the establishment of the Affordable Care Act, the federal government realized that 25% of the healthcare budget was associated with addiction. And so if you start to cut back on health services, you're really going to spend a lot more money as a result of the lack of attention to addiction. Even now, you know, we're partnering with some healthcare providers that we contract with to try to come to an understanding of the full cost of healthcare associated with those who receive addiction treatment, you know, those who succeed, those who don't, and what that really means and the kind of savings that occur after addiction treatment. And one of the major issues, especially for people that are homeless that require medical care, and they often require a great deal more medical care than folks who aren't homeless, is that they have a high readmission rate for hospitalization for their medical problems, and a lot of that's related to their addiction and the inability to continue medical care, continue medications and the like. So all the loss of these services not only undermines addiction treatment and the expense associated with that, it undermines medical treatment and those expenses.
Gotcha.
Elizabeth, it's about time for us to wrap it up, but we have a question for you.
Oh my goodness.
To end this evening. You know, we started the evening talking about the fact that we have an opioid epidemic, but well, we gathered tonight really to talk about the solutions that have been represented by our panelists this evening. The solutions are the good news, and oftentimes in the media, or the criticism of the media, is they're only focusing on the bad news. I take exception to that, but I can understand that sentiment. What is it that we, the panelists, the experts here, and those in the audience tonight, what is the good news? How do we get the good news to the mainstream, accurate media beyond CNN, because you all know this good news, but how do we get our stories to the media in a way that is compelling enough for you all to report on it?
You know, this is an interest, I get that question a lot for various issues, not just addiction. And what's interesting about this situation is that I think Americans are still trying to process how horrible this situation is. I mean, there's still unfortunately, it feels like there's a story every day, every week, or every month. It's like, look what happened in this community, look what happened in that community. So I think people are still trying to digest how bad it's become. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. A friend of mine said to me, oh, now we're talking about heroin, before it was crack, and recently it was methadone. Isn't this just like everything else? And I said, I don't think it is like everything else. And so I don't think that it's necessarily a bad thing that there is a focus on how bad it is, because I don't know that everyone's gotten that message yet. But as far as moving on and thinking about solutions, that's certainly something that we're thinking a lot about and have done stories on at CNN. And I know that others have done it too. And I know they're out there, I've seen them. As far as talking about them more, I think getting the success rates, the statistics out there, I think is very important. And getting the faces of that success is extremely important. Being able to show us someone who, hey, guess what? We started this great program. We instituted a drug court. We started a peer project, and here's someone who was helped by it. That makes a big difference.
Well, there you go. That's our call to action. You heard it from our senators who spoke here tonight. You've heard it from our panelists, and you've heard it from our moderator, Elizabeth Cohen. We have the responsibility now. We have the opportunity to take what we've learned here tonight, take it back into our communities, and share the good news that treatment works, recovery is possible, and that there are thousands of people like us who are in recovery, and thousands of families, frankly, that have carried on even when they have lost a loved one. There are thousands of families like yours who are recovering. So that is our call to action this evening, to take this knowledge, take this passion, take this enthusiasm, and carry that message back to wherever we're going to end up when we get home from this event. So on behalf of you, Elizabeth, thank you so much for what you have done tonight. To each and every one of our panelists, wow, thank you. To George Washington University and the incredible technical staff and the stage staff, hooray, hooray. To the Association of Recovery and Higher Education, and to my colleagues at the Hazel and Betty Ford Foundation, thank you very much. And most of all, thanks to you all for your commitment to be here this evening and for your good advocacy on behalf of those who still suffer. Good night.